If you're Trump, do you want some sort of recession and clearing event early in your presidency to get rid of the worst of the froth and the unsustainability, to give you the air cover to make really big reforms so that by the time you're in your third and fourth year of your administration, things are rebuilding, you've got good momentum and a positive trajectory, and you look really good by the end of your presidential term? For a long time now, I've been saying there's an incentive for Trump to do that, especially early on. He can still blame a ton of the stuff on Biden, like, oh, folks, you have no clue how bad it was, the system I inherited, now that I really know what it's like, but thank goodness I'm here and I've got my big, bold plan and all that stuff. If I were advising Trump, I would be advising him to get out there and be communicating the fact that things might be rough for a while, folks, but it'll be for a greater good later on. If he doesn't do that, I think it's a big miscalculation, because I think for a whole bunch of reasons, some things that Trump has control over, a lot of things that he doesn't have control over, things could get rockier from here. And if he hasn't communicated that, people might still be in the throes of those issues when we get close to the midterm election. And if there hasn't been a good expectations management, then they might be in that kind of throw the bums out mode. And then we'd have a blue wave, in that midterm election, which would then start to thwart a lot of what Trump's doing. Maybe Trump knows that. Maybe that's why he's scrambling too. As you know, I have been watching the employment market for a long time, because so goes employment, so goes the economy. And folks here, if they watch my channel and all, have probably heard me reference Michael Kantrowitz's HOPE framework, which is the progression for how an economy falls into recession. And HOPE is an acronym. It's housing, orders, profits, and employment. So employment's like the last domino to fall. And what's been interesting is we've seen lots of weakness in the housing market. For the past 2 years, we've had recessionary levels in many times of orders and profits, but employment has really stuck in. We've seen companies, ramping up layoffs over the past year and a half. We've seen the hiring freezes come in, but it really hasn't spilled over yet into any sort of, material problem in the visible problem in the employment market. Employment is still historically low at 4.0% right now at the time we're talking, right? Now, what's interesting is that doesn't necessarily mean it's been a healthy jobs market. And as you and I have talked about, the growth in jobs has been in two areas. It's been in part-time jobs, right? They've been on net, like no net private sector jobs created in the past year or two. It's all been short-term jobs, which is basically an indication that people are having to get side gigs just to kind of make ends meet. And then secondly, where there was job growth on the full-time job side, it was in the public sector. It was government jobs. Government was basically taking up all the slack, right? Well, we got a very different environment now. We got a bunch of government departments that aren't hiring anymore and are now hemorrhaging people or planning to hemorrhage people, right? So that's going to have a really big impact. Now, I've asked Michael Kantrowitz directly this, is that enough to tip the employment numbers into sort of a recessionary trajectory? As of right now, he doesn't think so. We're kind of in terra incognita here, both in housing and in employment, where a lot of the old correlations and the old relationships aren't necessarily playing out the same way this time that they were in the past. I'm not seeing like red flashing lights on my dashboard right now, but I'm not willing to say that things are going to be fine for the rest of this year. We're just going to have to take it as it comes, on a month-by-month basis going forward. I don't see how this doesn't have an increasing spillover effect. I also think that the DOGE, government layoffs are increasingly in parallel with continued weakness in the private market in terms of hiring. So we are seeing lots of store closures, lots of layoffs. Also, I live out here in Northern California, like I said, and the Cal State college system here has been struggling, and they just announced they've got to cut almost $400 million. And one of the Cal State colleges, Sonoma State, is close to where I am. And that college just announced that they're getting rid of all of their athletic departments, right? So every sport gone, every kid that was there on a scholarship just found out that their scholarship's gone. And they're just eviscerating a lot of their professorial staff at a lot of the other departments there at the school. So we're in danger of seeing this building storm of like big government, big public employers, but increasingly this drumbeat of private employers that are downsizing. And it's not just, one part of the economy. We're seeing all sorts of retail stores shut down, but we're seeing, the Mag 7. Those companies are continuing to lay people off. Meta just, I think 2 weeks ago, laid off like 4% of its employee base. So the momentum is to the downside here in terms of a worsening employment market. And at some point, there's going to be a critical mass where that really starts biting into the economy. Because as you said, firings and job loss are an incredibly emotional event. And obviously it's for the person who loses their job, right? There's the old saying, it's a recession when your neighbor loses their job, it's a depression when you lose yours. But when you start getting worried about your job, even if you haven't been fired yet, you start changing your behavior. Oh, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't take that trip just because I'm a little bit worried about what's happening at work right now, right? Maybe I should start saving a little bit more versus spending, right? And that starts impacting consumer spending, and we're a 70% consumer spending driven GDP. And so all you need is to hit that critical mass tipping point of sentiment where on a net basis, the consumer just starts tightening versus expanding their spending. And then that can really start to create a vicious cycle. I was not expecting the speed or the scope. When they started talking about DOGE during the campaign trail, I was thinking, okay, you're going to need to do stuff like this, but I did not imagine that they'd be able to move at this lightning speed that they have so far. Despite all the stuff we're talking about here, I'm actually beginning to become a little bit more bullish than I've been in previous years, long term. I think some of the policies that are now being pursued, if effected correctly, may be laying the groundwork for greater economic prosperity than we were set to have under the old plan. But I think there's a tremendous amount of unavoidable issues that we're going to have to confront, not just from the previous administration, but from many previous administrations. This is just all the unsustainable stuff we've been doing where the can's not going to be able to get kicked down the road anymore. We're going to have to pay the piper on a number of these things. Secondly, as I said earlier, I think the current administration, even if it's successful in the long term with the reforms it wants to create, I think that is going to create disruption in the near term, both economically and in the markets. But my point is since you're not being told it, if you're not paying attention to the data that I'm talking about here, then you're at risk of sort of sleepwalking into all this. And that's what I don't want people to do, right? So I think that the economy is going to have a rougher time ahead of it, and it's already slowing. Q3 of 2023, we had over 4% GDP growth. It's now just 2.3, and the trajectory is downwards. We're seeing signs of stress in both companies and consumers. There's sites you can go subscribe to. dailyjobscut.com is one of them, where they just give daily reports of all the layoffs that are going off, all the brands that are shuttering their doors. It's kind of depressing if you subscribe to it. I'm just going to warn you, because there's a real fire hose. It's not just, an update a week or two. It's like several times a day. The mortgage data, I think we are beginning to see delinquencies begin to rise. Not terribly yet, but remember, there's been a lot of delay in that system. It's a very lagging indicator because we had all the forbearance programs and all that stuff, right? But if you look at revolving debt that people have had all the way through COVID, credit card debt, auto loans, stuff like that, we're seeing recessionary levels of delinquencies right now in those, right? So the consumer's increasingly getting pinched. One of the narratives out there is there's a lot of homeowners in America, and they're actually doing pretty fine because 40% of them don't have a mortgage. Pretty much everybody else has a 3% mortgage, and they can kind of ride this out. Well, we're increasingly seeing data that people are getting to the point where they cannot afford their homes. They can't afford the upkeep, right? Property taxes have gone through the roof. Insurance has gone through the roof, especially if you live in a place like California or Florida or some of the places that recently got hit by storms, and just the cost of maintenance and repairs, et cetera, right? So The Guardian just came out with an article. The title is, "I Feel Trapped: How Homeownership Has Become a Nightmare for Many Americans." So we have this sort of false narrative that homeowners are in the catbird seat. An increasing number of them are beginning to become forced sellers. Even though I've got a 3% mortgage, I just can't afford this damn thing anymore, right? Because maybe they've gotten laid off or other cost of living has just squeezed them. So you end up with this sense of, or this picture of, stresses are mounting here in the system. And really what's been carrying everything through, both the general sales, but also the housing market, has been the top 20%, right? The affluent people who have been basically doing practically the majority of the spending now. And they've been keeping the averages looking good. Well, now you look at the data, they're starting to struggle. They're not necessarily in a lot of pain yet, but we're definitely seeing, the expensive toys aren't selling anymore, right? So we're seeing distress in like the ATVs and the jet skis and stuff like that. A lot of luxury brands have been releasing disappointing forecasts for the better part of a year now. People aren't buying the Rolexes and the fancy handbags that they used to. And even what's been interesting is Walmart has actually benefited from a lot of mass affluent shoppers downshifting their purchasing from higher brand stores to Walmart, right? Well, now Walmart just disappointed this week. The stock was down like almost 7% after its earnings guidance guidance because it had a blowout quarter, but its forecast for the coming year was basically showing that it was expecting cooling consumer demand pretty much across all its consumer categories. My point here is people are beginning to get to their exhaustion points. And this is all adding up to the fact that the economy is getting more precarious. You then add into it all the still potential volatility, disruption, and unknowns of what's going on with the new administration. And it basically says, folks, you should just be preparing for more turbulent times ahead. And if you're not, to my earlier point, I think you're really putting yourself and your family's prospects at risk by sort of willfully being blind to this. And like I said, sleepwalking into, potential tougher times. I would have said we're probably in a pretty early inning of a housing correction. What I think is going to happen is lower prices are ahead, and it might take a decade on average in markets to get back to where we are. And what's interesting, we've talked about some factors here, right? But we haven't talked about the financial markets. So we haven't talked about the fact that there could be a substantial market correction here too, that also creates an additional negative wealth effect, right, to what's going on. I'm not here to sell doom and gloom or anything like that, but I just want to point out that for all the cracks that you and I have been seeing in the housing market now for the past year and a half that we've been doing these interviews, the average price has still gone up. And even that Zillow report that you just put up there, their forecast for the year dropped, but it was still a positive 0.9% increase. And Melody Wright, she just got the December sales data. And for the first time, she said, look, I've been very pessimistic about where housing's headed, but I haven't been willing to call for a national negative decline in housing prices on an annual basis yet. But after this recent data, she now has stuck her neck out and said, I'm actually calling that 2025 is going to actually be a down year nationally. My point is there's a good chance that the market is at a minimum going to just tread sideways, but probably more likely have a material correction at some point this year or next, right? Which will add a negative wealth effect into the mix in addition to everything that we're talking about. So if you are, in the housing market, time is on your side, most likely if you're a buyer. If you find the dream house and you can afford it and you're going to be there for a while, great, seize it while it's in the moment. If not, time's on your side. If you're a seller, you really got to ask yourself some questions here, right? Or if you're a homeowner, you're going to ask yourself some tough questions. How much longer do I expect to be here, right? Am I going to need to sell relatively soon, or can I ride out the next 5-10 years? How good do I feel about my income? Is there a chance I could lose my job? Do I have other savings, investments I can rely on or not? And if you think that I either have been planning on selling soon, or I'm kind of worried about my job and I couldn't afford my house if I did, you might need to ask yourself, look, do I want to be preemptive here or proactive here and get out in front of this thing? And look, this is individual decisions for every person depending on your own personal financial situation and what's going on in your local area in which you live. So this is not a blanket statement for folks, but I do think in general, there is a first mover advantage to sellers when you go into a turning market like this, right? If you delay, and sellers have been largely trying to hold it together and not sell, so let's wait for the Fed to bring rates down and kind of rescue us from this. But at some point when people start bolting from the herd and dropping their prices and saying, look, I'm worried I'm going to lose my home equity that I have right now, I may as well drop the price by 5-10% and still get 90+% of my equity out, right? There's a first mover advantage. And once that starts to happen, you can see the potential for cascading prices from there. And if you're a reluctant or resistant seller, you may be chasing that all the way down, right? You may be one of those people that ends up saying, oh my God, I kind of got behind the ball here. And now that I'm really getting serious about this, prices have already corrected by 20% or 25% or 30%. I'm not trying to be extreme, but there are markets like Austin or places in Florida that have already seen that, right? Inventory has really dried up, and there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. And so the only people that are really transacting are these rich people. And here's just a quote from Fortune, quoting the Toll Brothers CEO. He says, more than 70% of business is from wealthy move-ups and empty nesters with years of home price appreciation. The rest are rich millennials. So it's confirmation that it's the rich that can play in this market, right? So they're pretty much the only one trading these markets. Obviously, they're trading higher value homes, which is why prices have stayed high, right? So the big question has been, all right, to help out the little guy, the regular person, what do we need? Well, we need more inventory coming online, right? And it hadn't been for a good long while, but it is starting to, right? That's where we've seen in the places that have had big price drops, Austin, now Dallas, Florida, even starting in places like Nashville, like inventory is starting to come online for multiple reasons. So it's home builders are still building in some of these markets. You're beginning to get people that are big employers, or like you're starting to see this in DC. It's starting to happen, right? Inventory is coming on because people are losing their jobs or fearful of losing their jobs. You've got short-term rentals. All the folks that bought Airbnbs now aren't making as much money. They're starting to dump. A lot of the institutional investors are starting to get get out of certain markets. And then we have this stressed owner that we talked about, right? The guy that just basically said, look, I'm living on Social Security here and all my other costs have gone up so much, I just literally can't afford this roof over my head anymore, even if I have a quote unquote cheap mortgage, right? So there's potential here that inventory is really going to start increasing in a way that we haven't seen for the past couple of years. And that really will change the game. And that'll actually be a good thing in the long run. It'll make for a more efficient market. It'll hopefully improve affordability, right? Which is at record levels of unaffordability. It's highly likely going to improve it by bringing prices down, which is good for aspiring buyers. Not so great if your home equity is your biggest source of your savings. But this goes back to my earlier point kind of about fiscal prudence, where we can talk about it and say, yes, we all think that the government should spend less money and be more responsible with it, right? But the price of that is going to be job cuts and shrinking a lot of government. You have to take that with it, right? So we all say, hey, we want more affordable homes. Yeah, I think we can all get on that bandwagon. But part of that price is that if you love the current price of your home, it may go down. Probably mathematically is going to have to make housing more affordable. So there's no free lunch here. Like it or hate it, you just should be eyes wide open about it.